Right. Other one is, you'll have to forgive my Ashkenazis. I'll try and speak a little bit in Havara Sfaradit, but I'll flip every so often probably into my mother native Germanic tongue. Okay, so it's, as I said, a huge honor to be here, and I can only apologize I can't be here more often. Just I teach usually this, so this night I got a night off, that's so we can teach here. So it's a share and shared discussion. I want to begin the story. The question of was Rambam, was he concealing his Aristotelianism, with a very prominent and relatively famous academic, Leo Strauss. Strauss is kind of the modern proponent of this idea, but we'll trace its history, hopefully at some point. And also, Sina, you'll tell me also time-wise where we're going too long, too boring, or you got to cut me off, whatever.
It's never too boring with you, Rav, so take your time.
And also, people want to ask along the way. Hopefully there'll be time for questions, but if there's points you want to clarify, I feel you want to violently disagree, save that till the end. You want to thrash the whole thesis, save it till the end as well. But if the points of clarification or questions along the way, feel more than invited. Okay, so Strauss was a German-American academic, political philosopher, classicist. He was born 1899 and died in 1970, October 73, 2 years before I was born. And amongst his many contributions to academia and to thought in general was his analysis of esotericism and exotericism in political writing, in philosophical writing. Well, that means the exoteric, again, I hope I'm not patronizing anybody for, I don't know, everyone's probably got different backgrounds and knowledge, but I'll try to, when a term is potentially not understandable by everybody, I'll try and just explain it. And if you find that you all know, or I'm not explaining things well, just stop me. Okay, so the exoteric meaning is the overt meaning of the text. The esoteric is the hidden one. He, in fact, in 1952, has actually quite a famous work called Persecution and the Art of Writing. He actually has an argument that before the 18th century, pretty much all major thinkers, it sounds like he's saying, certainly many, wrote in a very repressed manner because of the nature of censorship, because thinkers were often actually challenging norms at the time, but were afraid. So their style of writing, the default style, he felt in 1930s Germany could relate to it, being incredibly careful about what you write and how you write it. But if you trace his intellectual journey, it actually begins with HaRambam. It begins with Maimonides and Al-Farabi. Those who know the guide, which I assume is most people here, will know that Al-Farabi is possibly the most quoted figure in the guide. I haven't counted, but very likely. Certainly an enormous influence in terms of philosophy, physics, all the things we would, understanding of Aristotle on the Rambam. And Al-Farabi did actually write a number of works that are clearly designed for different audiences, in which he pretty much overtly actually advocates different positions. Some are more Aristotelian, some that are more for the masses are more, if you like, quote unquote, you might call it something mainstream Islamic or naive Islamic or pre-philosophic Islamic. And Strauss is convinced that the Rambam is the same. And that his works for the masses, the Pirush HaMishnah and the Mishneh Torah are kind of more, at least overtly and more clearly mainstream, naive, pre-philosophic, although they're clearly not pre-philosophic, but meaning they're kind of taking what you'd think were standard Jewish approaches to things like Hashgacha, Nevuah, Nisim, etc., etc. Although again, that's always a bit difficult because he doesn't take those positions, those texts. But you wouldn't be troubled, put it that way, if you were, let's use it for want of a better term, if you were an untrained, philosophically not very trained, you wouldn't be. He wants to argue you wouldn't have been troubled by those works. And in the Moreh Nevuchim, he argues in the guide, in the Dalalat, he basically. There also, he took one position overtly, but there already he let you see what's going on beneath the surface. Now, one of the difficulties with that straight away is you could actually argue that about any of the Rambam's works, but it goes like this. The overt text of the guide, the overt position articulated, particularly in the second section of the guide, is that yes, Rambam uses Aristotle's argument for the existence of God. He equivocates. He doesn't like the position that was taken by the Kalam philosophers. Broadly speaking, the Islamic world was divided. Again, this is not a talk on Islamic medieval philosophy. So, but broadly speaking, you kind of say in the Eastern Islamic world, it was more typical to think along the lines of the Mutakallim when he talks about the Kalam, which had some great scholars and thinkers, but they engage with Aristotelian thought, typically negating a lot of its core ideas. They took a more, if you like, traditionalist approach. Their view was that natural laws are somewhat illusory. It's ultimately, everything is reducible to kind of these indivisible, infinitesimal particles that take on forms. It doesn't take on properties. It's not so important to understand their view for this. The point is that they believe the universe has a beginning. They believe there was a contradiction built into Aristotle, because Aristotle talks about the fact that you can't have an actual infinity, only a potential infinity, but then he also believes the universe can be eternally eternal. And so they argue they found a contradiction. They basically argue the universe had to have a beginning. Rambam attacks their arguments, the models they build, but he says that the truth is whether they're right or whether Aristotle's right. Aristotle believed in eternity of the universe. So whichever one is correct, it doesn't matter, because either one has to accept the idea of God, who's one, who's incorporeal. That's effectively the strategy of the guide. And then Rambam acknowledges there's differences. There's going to be very important differences. One is whether we believe in creation in the kind of literal or almost any natural reading of Bereshit, or whether that has to be radically reinterpreted. Another will affect things like how we look at hashgacha, right? According to Aristotle, there can be no hashgacha, not from God anyway. God is an inert first cause. That's the usual way of understanding Aristotle, and therefore doesn't directly intervene in anything. That has to be done through the active intellect, lower down. It affects nevuah, because obviously prophecy wouldn't be God talking. It would be man climbing up and maybe getting some insight. It would affect lots and lots and lots of things. So overtly, the Rambam's position is actually somewhere in between. He accepts the Aristotelian proof of God. He doesn't accept that there's a knockout argument for eternity of the universe. He doesn't accept there's an argument either way that's convincing. He dedicates a lot of time to analyzing the logic of arguments purporting to show one way. And he concludes there isn't really, in his time, a knockout blow either way. And therefore, since it will do quite a lot of textual and theological reworking away from the default natural position, we will work with the assumption of creation. We will work with the assumptions that are not, he does wrestle a lot with where Hashgacha does and doesn't fit in, doesn't take quite the Aristotelian position, but nor does he take the opposite position, and so on. But that according to and same with Nevuah, same with all of these things. According to Strauss, all of that's actually an exoteric, necessary smoothing over. But actually, if you listen deeply and carefully, throughout the guide are little hints that's not the Rambam's real position. That number one, there was a more radical underlying position, which he's letting only those who are really scholarly and really paying close attention pick up on. And that is that actually he believed in much, much more strong Aristotelian position than he lays out, himself. And number two, Strauss goes even further. I'll give you the defenses of position one, and then I'll talk about position two. Position two is actually Rambam may even have doubted whether God existed at all. That is the standard way to understand Strauss. Strauss himself writes very esoterically, so you can't be 100% sure what he's saying, but that's the standard way of understanding him. Now, what are the arguments for each of these positions? And by the way, Strauss, you should know, those of you who look for the English translation, so one of the best ones is the Shlomo Pines, would have been the native tribe. We'll call him Pines. It's just that reads better in English that way. But he himself actually was originally much more conservative in his reading of the Rambam, and Strauss actually convinced him to believe in this esoteric position, and so did many others. I would say till around to. I mean, it's still a position that exists within academia, no question about it. I'll talk about the current position soon. But the arguments for this, Strauss has many. Strauss has a lot of very careful attention to the text, picks up on all sorts of clues he believes the Rambam has left us, including, and people often think he's going too far on this, but there's actually maybe based on a text the Rambam has nothing to do with Torah, but in its numbers way, he believes even the numbering of chapters gives hints to what the Rambam's thinking. Okay, most of his ideas are considered, most people would be at least skeptical about them, but there are some that are quite strong and oft-repeated arguments for believing in an esoteric view. One of them, and probably the most famous, is the introduction to the Rambam, the third introduction, it depends on how you divide the introductions, right? But almost the last line before he starts the actual chapter 1 of section 1 is when he talks about why contradictions appear in books. He gives 7 different reasons. The fifth one is that sometimes when you're teaching very difficult matter, So you have to necessarily, teach in oversimplified ways that later on, as you get more and more complex and the students more and more able to understand, when you look back, you'll think it's a contradiction to what he said earlier. You'll realize he was just providing a stepping stone. I think we can think nowadays of lots of analogies to this. When you're learning chemistry in the beginning, you learn like, electrons, these little balls that go flying around things. Then when you get older, you learn a bit more physics, you realize that was a kind of very, very crude analogy that eventually breaks down. So a stepping stone approach, you have to say things in more simplistic ways or without perfect analogies for them as you're building up, and afterwards it will look like there's contradictions. But then his seventh reason is that sometimes you're in very, very deep things, you're going to have to hide a little bit for the mass. I'm going to read to you Rav Kapach's translation of this, or Kafich, however you pronounce him. I'll call him Rav Kapach, I hope you don't mind. But there he says in the seventh reason, let me just quote it inside here. The seventh reason, when things are very deep, you have to hide some and reveal others. But sometimes you need to basically build something on a particular premise, and that will create a problem in another place. Elsewhere, you'll develop an argument that's going to rely on a different premise that contradicts the first premise, that contradicts the premise in the first argument. And therefore, we need to make sure the masses don't figure out there's a contradiction there. And that's what he says. And then he basically says at the end, at least in the standard translations, that all the contradictions you're going to find in the guide are of the fifth and seventh nature. There was one other text that also put the sixth in, but the key is the seventh. The seventh is like, you have to hide things from the masses. And that leads this, that's obviously a very natural to go from there and go, why are we hiding from the masses? Presumably because, and it's very important the masses don't pick up on these contradictions. So that's a good ground to suspect there's something the masses that we should be afraid of the masses knowing, and an obvious understanding will be something the masses would consider heretical or challenging or undermining to their faith or to their adherence to the law. So you might have a kind of a sophisticated view that if you really understood things well, you could be an Aristotelian and be fully committed to Torah mitzvot. But if you're a bit less sophisticated and you took an Aristotelian view and you didn't have kind of these naive views of reward and punishment and God about to intervene and hurt you, you would probably drop Torah mitzvot. So we have to make sure the masses don't know what's going on. That's a standard reason, obviously one that Strauss himself would have presumably have held of, but also one that others often quote, and that is probably a very strong support for this thesis. There is another one. Strauss himself actually alludes to this other one. It is trying to remember exactly. I think it's in Chavav. Yeah, that's right. Section 2, Perek Chavav 26. There's a very important piece here. Midrash quotes from Rabbi Eliezer Gadol, the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. Basically, he deals with it earlier in the guide as well. Earlier on, when the Rambam talks about, the Rambam has basically a disproportionate amount of everything the Rambam interprets, both in the Mishneh Torah and the guide, and actually even in Pirush Mishnah to some degree. Relate to 4 episodes. One is the ladder in Yaakov's dream. 2 of them are to do with Moshe Rabbeinu, chapter 24 and chapter 33 of Shemot, of Exodus. I'll come back to chapter 24 soon, and then the Nevuah, the prophecies of Yechezkel and the other Maaseh Merkavah prophecies. But the chapter 24 of Shemot is when Moshe Rabbeinu goes up the mountain, and it's given in the Torah after the account of Sinai. Moshe goes up the mountain, and the Rambam's terminology going up means may include also physically going up, but it also means conceptually going up. They were all invited up, but only Moshe Rabbeinu really got up the mountain. And then it talks at the end of that little episode with the elites of the Jewish people, God didn't send out his hand, which implies, as the Midrash and the Rambam and Rashi and everyone learns, that they should have been punished. So they looked at the God of Israel. They see tachat raglav under his feet. They see it looks like the kind of, in the Rambam's understanding, this translucent or transparent thing. They looked at the God of Israel, and they ate and they drank. And the Rambam actually in many places interprets bits and eventually interprets the whole story. And what he says is, essentially what he says is that the elites of the Bnei Israel were eating and drinking, meaning they were too physical when they were trying to grasp and study God. and they confused God for this chomer rishon, this kind of first matter. That's a contradiction, because later in the guide he says it can actually refer to something much, much higher up than the first matter. But whatever it is, it's not God himself. And they confused God with something near the core of creation. They made a mistake, possibly very similar, by the way, to what he might think Aristotle's error is. But very subtle, one that your philosophical mind won't be able to pick up on the fact you're doing, but you can when you think very, very deeply. If you're not prepared sufficiently, if you're not removed your own physical nus, which I'll come back to, why that should make any difference, then you can make an error thinking you're thinking about God when actually you're thinking about something at the core of creation instead. And then he says, I thought about this idea thanks to something in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which I'll discuss later on. And that discussion takes place in section 2, chapter 26. And he says something unbelievable. He quotes this Medrash of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, Yoter tmuim mem b'divrei af echad ma'alchim b'Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. I never seen anything so shocking, from anybody who follows Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. Shu amad dvarim shamash. He says things shema l'shana, listen to his language. Amasha hashamayim ma'izeh makom nivrau. How was the heaven created? Me'olav u'shol, from the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's dress, clothing. Lakach v'nateka salma, stretched out like some kind of garment. They were stretched and went. Like the pasuk says, he stretches it out. Okay. So there you go. The verse is telling you, and the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is telling you, there's some kind of material from which God expands and builds out the heavens. And then he says, how did earth come into being? From this snow thing, something white under the throne of glory. Now you have to go through all the Rambam's other chapters and work out what each of these words actually means, but we're not going to do that now. Actually throws it out. This is the text said over there. If only I could know. Those of you who know the Rambam's language will know this is such a telling phrase. If only I could know what this Chacham is thinking. Is this Chacham telling us that there wasn't a creation, something from nothing? Is he saying there's always been some kind of matter going around forever? Etc., etc. And that's again. Then he goes on and says something else. But in that little line, it sounds like he's saying, did Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer just tell us that there wasn't a creation? Right? The Rambam does that at least one other place, by the way. This is the main one, but there is at least one other place like that, where he kind of seems to throw out a line that would be more beneficial if you would support the position of the eternity of the universe. Right? He does it in the logic and near the beginning of the second section as well, where he says there's always, if you believe something has an ultimate cause, you've got to ask, so why didn't it cause its effect much earlier? And you've got to come up with some kind of justification. And if you believe in the cause was something from nothing, then you've got to really explain it. Now, those are two of the places, probably the two most prominent. This is the most prominent. But Rambam sounds like he's exploring this possibility. Now, if you put all this together, you have a little case going on saying, in one large parts of the guide, he says, I'm not really going along with this eternity of the universe. But I'll just drop you a little hint where you're not expecting it and then move on. And the masses won't notice I just dropped a little contradiction in there. And I want the experts to realize that I did that little contradiction. And I've told you elsewhere, this is a very important chapter. So I'm hinting to you that I really believe in the eternity of the universe. That is, and therefore everything else which I contradict everyone else and say that was Aristotle's view, but we don't hold of it. Listen carefully, and I'll take this, reapply it, and everything I tell you I don't believe, I really do believe. Strauss actually says the more the Rambam says something isn't true is the greatest proof that he thinks it is true. That's how radical he goes. Anyway, it's not an impossible position, and certainly these are tantalizing views. I want to just take it a little bit, drop more radically, because there is an even more radical position, which I told you. And here there was an essay by a professor called Warren Harvey, who was in the Hebrew U Department of Jewish Thought. And he actually says as follows. Again, I'm not going to dwell too long on it, but he actually wants to take the position. Let me just find, I had it written out over. Takes the position that there's a hint in the guide. The Rambam goes even further than that. What is the hint in the guide? So, okay, if you take the text the way we have it now, which is the text that in the Pines edition, it's the text in the Kapach edition is very similar. I'm going to read you the English translation. I often think with the Mora, although Kapach's translation is not me being a perfect Arabic speaker, but within academia, by the way, it was largely ignored for many years. Today it's being treated a little bit more seriously. And it is, from what I understand from people who speak Arabic, and it's actually a brilliant, anyway, but be that, it doesn't need my haskama, but anyway, so you can read it there, but the Pine's translation in Arabic is also supposed to be pretty good. So I'll read it to you. This is as follows. The text here says like this. It's right at the end. It's right at the end of chapter. 1 second. It's right at the end of. I've just momentarily forgotten where it is in the book. I'm going to read the quote anyway. It's right at the end of chapter 20 something. Let me have a look if I can just quickly find it. It's in the chapter where he basically talks to Yosef ben Yehuda, the person he's writing this text to, and he tells him that he should realize that Aristotle didn't get everything right about the cosmos. I'm trying to think 1 second. I have in my head. Okay, it escapes me just for this second. Very annoying to. Okay, whatever. I'll come back to me. But either way, I know where it is. I know exactly where it is. Chaftarat. Good. Okay, fine. It's section 2, chapter 24. Here it is. Okay, so I'm going to read you the English translation of it. It's almost, with the exception of one word, the Pine's translation is identical to the Kapach translation. That word I don't think is critically significant. So I'll read you the Pine's translation here in the actual article. Okay, for it is impossible for us to accede to the points starting from which conclusions may be drawn about the heavens. Heavens means, it's the English translation of the Galgalim, of the outer spheres. The Aristotelian cosmological model, in fact, there were debates between the different thinkers. Rabbi and Averroes had slightly different models, but what they all have in common is the Earth is in between 4 different layers, each of which is dominated by one of the elements: earth, water, air, fire, as usual order. And above them are these Galgalim, these orbital forces, these wheels, of which you can identify 9, but they subdivide into 5, and the Rambam thinks really 4 of these Galgalim that drive, and their motion ultimately generates everything below, and and they're driven by Sechalim Nivdalim, by these, they themselves have consciousness. They're not of the same matter as things below, and their consciousness draws to these active intellects. These active intellects power them. And that's the basic structure. There are subtleties within all of that. But he says, in truth, when you look at the Aristotelian picture of the world, and then you look at the Ptolemaic epicycles, they don't really work together. And he's sort of expressed a certain skepticism about the Aristotelian position. And he says as follows. He says, for it's impossible for us to accede to the points starting from which conclusions may be drawn about the heavens. For the latter are too far away from us and too high in place in rank. In other words, the human brain can't easily grasp these things. They're not as observable as things going on Earth. And even the word even is the Pines of this, the general conclusion that may be drawn from them, namely that they prove the existence of their mover, in the Pines translation, is a matter the knowledge of which cannot be reached by human intellect. That in isolation sounds like what he's saying is, when I gave you all these chapters showing how from the Galgalim we can get to proof of a creator, truth is, since we can't really know that much about these Galgalim, maybe we can't know anything about whether there even is a creator. If you've ever read Strauss' introduction to the guide, I recommend, if you haven't noticed that he says the exact same thing, which is very possible to not notice, just go back now and reread the introduction, more or less the second last page of the introduction to the Pines. You'll see that once you realize this is the issue, you'll see he's basically saying it more or less black on white. And that's very much his position too, but he says it's also in his own esoteric way. Now, why do scholars not accept this? Why do many scholars not accept this particular? I mean, this particular thing is much more rare for scholars to accept it. So there's a very interesting paper by someone called Joel Kramer. Joel Kramer was a professor at Chicago, actually an Arab-speaking, very high. He makes a number of points on this. First is that it's not exactly a perfect translation anyway, but it's very famous. Ibn Tibban, Shmuel Ibn Tibban, who wrote the first translation of the guide, actually was in correspondence with the Rambam. And in the manuscript, he himself has a note where he believes the text here is mistaken, which is interesting. Now, usually he believes mistaken. There were corruptions in the text by the time they got to him, and some of them we know he wrote to the Rambam, and usually the Rambam confirmed he was right. Here we don't have the letters between him and the Rambam as to whether when he actually asked that to the Rambam, and what the Rambam replied. But when Ibn Tibon writes that, there's good reason to think that. And the truth is, it's not just out of context. Just with a few extra Arabic words, it makes so much more sense. Whereas he basically says, apart from the proof of the creator, there's not much else we can know. The reason that makes much more sense is not the idea of, because he says things elsewhere that are different. That's Kramer's argument. We could always say, yeah, but here's his little hint. It's that if you look at his argument, they're very rigorous, right? Very well structured, very much fitted in with the views of Al-Farabi and everybody else really at the time. Perhaps just add a little more rigor to some of the premises and some of the deductions. But anyone in his time would have found it impossible to see any good reason why you don't need to know anything about the spheres at all, except they move in some kind of circular motion, and his views about agency and causation, which were the standard views of every philosopher at the time, pretty much, who in the Western Islamic world, to all the deduction just flow. There's nothing you need to know. It doesn't matter whether Ptolemaic epicycles or whether Aristotelian, they don't seem to have any impact on the argument at all. So it'd be very bizarre if him thinking that we don't know everything about exactly how has any impact on this argument. So that's kind of, so the more extreme position is less held of. But the more kind of the view that maybe there was a hidden Aristotelianism is also one that's hotly debated. And I'm going to show you some of the counter arguments. And then I want to tell you something which some of you may find very surprising. And then I'd like to get to a non-Aristotelian position. I don't know if I'm going to get it all done in one night, but this is such a big topic. But let's see. So first of all, what are the questions that scholars, I'm talking both in secular and religious terms, who have a more conservative view of the Mora ask on this view, right? They obviously owe an explanation as to what it is the Rambam really is hiding. And they owe an explanation to those 2 or 3 places where the Rambam sounds like he is hinting at the possibility of an eternal universe. They owe some explanation for that. That's certainly the case. They would counter-argue a few things. First of all, if Rambam really is going to efforts to hide his views, then why give so much ground to Aristotle as he clearly does? Like, couldn't he have taken more conservative positions, right? That would have been more mass-friendly and just kept dropping these hints. Then maybe Aristotle's right. Okay, that's actually a more debatable argument. But the biggest problem is he's very consistent throughout all his writings as to exactly what he's going to hide and exactly why he needs to hide it. He must hide Sitrei Torah. He's got to hide the secrets of Torah, because the Gemara, the Mishnah says, in Darshan, you do not teach the Maaseh Bereshit, you don't teach the works of creation with more than one person. When you're setting up a mass position, this is necessarily unphilosophical, right? But Rambam, according to the interpreters of the guide itself, has esotericism, exotericism within it, then they're going to argue that even the philosophical position, which is necessarily philosophical, is going to also be a trick. You know, that's kind of the issue with that problem. It's easy if you'd say the Mishnah Torah just contradicted the guide, but it doesn't. That's the problem. The Mishnah Torah is also if you read the guide esoterically, you could also argue the Mishnah Torah is esoteric. And in fact, those who banned the guide famously banned Sefer Madar, right? He in Sefer Madar, he says many of the things he says that sound quite radical. In the guide, he just doesn't elaborate on to the same degree, but they're all there. Not all, but most of them. In fact, in one particular area, he's more radical earlier in life, namely the limitation of miracle. In the guide, he gives more leeway for that than he does in his earlier works. Either way, one of the biggest problems is this, but all the way through, question interpretation, Rambam was skeptic about Hashem's essence. Okay, I'm going to talk a little more. I'm going to try and come to the questions a bit later, if that's okay. I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that we cover the core material. I apologize to questions that are coming up now. So he's got this all the way through, running from the Pirush Mishnah on Chagiga, through the Mishnah Torah in the 2nd chapter and in the 4th chapter in several places, through the guide in the introduction, through the introduction to the 3rd section. And when he gets to the Parakim, Aleph to Zayin, 1 to 7 of the 3rd section, everything he writes esoterically. There he's literally interpreting or taking you through the chapter 1 of Yechezkel and comparing it to chapter 10 of Yechezkel and Yeshayahu, the 3 Maaseh Merkavah chapters. And there you absolutely see, I mean, he's hiding. Just look at, if you just want to see a hidden chapter in the guide, just read chapter 7 of section 3. It's the best example of what you call teaching with Rashi Prakim, of teaching with chapter headings, but making sure you don't talk about the subject matter. And only a student who really knows what's going on, Chacham Mevinu Midato, will have a clue what's going on there. And you have to work really, 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 really hard to even think you've quite understood what he's going on about. And very often your eyes just pop open, you go, oh my goodness, when I compare that chapter to that chapter and that chapter to that chapter, I suddenly, whoa, that's what the Rambam's saying. And you know, and that's what he's hiding. And actually, my recommendation, I don't know if you've came to the same conclusion, is it's worth reading the Moreh through once. And then the second time one reads it through, in my humble essay, because I don't mean that's not false humility. I'm not a particularly massive I'm not a particularly massive Maimonidean scholar, but it seems to me that if one, the second time round, studies those 7 chapters together with the Psukim, writes down all the questions you can think of and all the mysteries, and then read the guide again from beginning to end, taking note of everything. And by the way, Kapach's footnotes are gold for this. So are some of the classical commentators as well. But I think he's got the benefit of the sweep of all of history putting it together, and then keeping it. Then you come up with some gems. It's so beautiful. Anyway, but the point is that the Rambam's told us everything he's hiding, and he's told us exactly why he's got to hide it, and exactly why he's got to make sure the masses don't understand what he's saying. He's very, very consistent in why he has to make sure the masses don't understand this, and why he's going to have to use contradictions. Therefore, and that's all the way through all his works. So and it's because, I'll explain it a little bit soon, but roughly because when you're trying to grasp God, it is so easy to get it wrong. In fact, if you're not very trained, and even if you're very philosophically trained, but you haven't shed enormous amounts of physicality, anger, all these things from you, necessarily you're going to be projecting things onto God that aren't there. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are and how deeply you've gone, you're still going to get it wrong, and perhaps even dangerously so. This is consistent with absolutely everywhere. And so now an esotericist is going to have to say, well, that's not really what he's hiding. He's actually hiding something totally different. The Sitrei Torah in the Moreh Nevuchim are Aristotelianism. So what were the Sitrei Torah in his earlier works that he said he's going to eventually write a work about? Was that also Aristotle all the way back then, when he wrote Mishneh Torah, when he wrote the Pirush HaMishnayot? That would be very radical. That would mean probably his father had been Aristotelian. I mean, this would be stuff that would be very, very difficult to fathom. I mean, his entire life was playing a lie. He was basically taking the Gemara and Chagiga, which presumably he didn't think were the rabbis secretly hiding their Aristotelianism, although maybe he'd say that too. Sitrei Torah is not that they're difficult to grasp. It's they undermine the whole of faith. And the Gemara has secretly been hiding a code that it doesn't believe in things. It would be a very, very radical position to take. And I think that's why, and it's interesting, I don't know what happened in the year 2005, but around about that year, there was a bit of a move in the academic community away from this. Not a bit of a move. I would say today there's quite, not that the esoteric view isn't held of in the academic community, but I'll give you a quote. It's actually an interesting quote. It was written in 2017. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, by the way, is one of the best resources for learning anything philosophical on the web, that's open to the masses. And the article on Maimonides, which is written by Kenneth Seeskin, he wrote he's basically the editor of the Cambridge Companion in 2005. And he wrote the following line, which I think is an accurate, my understanding, I'm not a full-time scholar in this area, but it is that of late, the esotericist reading appears to be losing favor. I think that's a fair, and for largely for reasons I've articulated, which doesn't mean it doesn't have grounds. You know, I'm not going to be one of these that stands up, that's it, it's gone, you know. No, there's definitely serious people who hold of it, very serious people. But I think this sort of consideration I've raised here are the sorts of things that make people skeptical if that really is plausible. That's what the Rambams do. It's not impossible, but it requires a certain leap of credulity that's not impossible, but difficult to believe. There are other questions as well. For example, the Rambam's very emphatic that negation, there's levels of negation. He asked if all you have to do is negate the attributes of God. So what was so special about what Moshe or Shlomo Melech had? And he has a very important line where he says, around about 59 or some way, where he says, there's actually levels of negation. And no matter how far you've negated, you can negate more. Now, the Aristotelian model of God is not like that. You just negate everything and you're left with an inert God, at least the way Aristotle was generally understood. So, therefore, this whole, and he has quite a lot of focus on how you've got to spend your basic life constantly getting deeper and then negating a bit more deeper. That doesn't work with the Aristotelian model. Neither does, you know, for example, he writes in around one of the 30s, I think around 33, 34 somewhere, I think, that he says that, you know, if you negate wrongly, you'll end up just taking more or less stripping the concept of God of much meaning. That also doesn't make sense if he has the Aristotelian position, and so on. So there's a lot of reasons to question this. Now, what I want to drop in right now, and this might come as many of you may know this, or many of you may not know this, I'm going to come back to it, but Strauss did not invent this way of learning the Rambam. It's very likely that Ibn Tibbon himself did. I'm going to come back to that one because it will play out very majorly. I know a theme that's many people are concerned with very often is the whole Maimonidean controversies. I want to tell you what I'm going to argue later on is that the radical view of the Rambam was actually very mainstream amongst a lot of the Catalonian and Provence supporters of the Rambam. Very mainstream. I'm going to come back to the history of that soon. And I think that had a very, very big impact on the reception of the Rambam in that area during the let's say 1230s, 40s, particularly the year of the most vicious controversy in the book burning and so on. And without that interpretation, I'm not saying there wouldn't have been a controversy, but it certainly played an outsized role in the controversy. But I'm going to come back to that. Just wanted to drop that little gem in there, a little hypothesis, which we will come back and re-explore. Let me talk for a little bit, for a few minutes, as to what it is that that Rambam, I think, a sort of some direction to understanding these things. First of all, there's a really fascinating view that has begun to become also spoken about more and more in academia, and that is the view that the Rambam is, broadly speaking, not Aristotelian, or sorry, not more Aristotelian than he sounds like he is, but that he drops in some of these little chapters because he's, I don't want to use the word hedging, but not a million miles away from hedging. There's a very, very interesting article. Let me see if I can find it. I've got a whole pile of them somewhere here. So I should be more organized about myself. By a Barry Lamb professor called Zvi Langerman, who basically points out what I said earlier, that the Rambam seems to soften his hard position that leaves less room for miracle earlier in life, and throughout the guide seems to equivocate. And his hypothesis is that the Rambam is offering opportunity for more than one possibility. This is a view, I think her name is Sarah Klein-Breslavi, a very, very big Rambam expert, basically articulates. A woman called Dr. Rivka Knella has a very, very nice essay on this, talking about Ma'aseh Merkava, because a lot of the interpreters of the Rambam think his Ma'aseh Merkava was was basically Aristotelian physics and a very little bit of metaphysics, but not very deep at all. Ibn Tibbon interpreted the Rambam that way. The Abarbanel interpreted the Rambam that way, and they both critiqued the Rambam for going like too radical on that. So she has all of these thinkers have a very interesting view. I would say, again, I'm not trying not to oversimplify. It's like this. The Rambam basically, and if you listen carefully, I think the Rambam more or less says this. It says, it's possible Aristotle is right, but no argument currently around really forces his position. Aristotle himself didn't believe it was proven. And therefore, we don't have sufficient reason to try to completely reread the whole of Torah and completely redo the whole of Jewish theology. But it is possible someday someone will prove creation, and it is equally possible that somebody one day might prove that Aristotle is correct. Ibn Tibbon felt that he'd done it, by the way. And if somebody were to prove Aristotle's correct, what's going to happen to the faith of the intelligentsia? So I want to drop you little hints along the way as to what you'll do if that ever turned out to be true. You might have a Pirkei of Eliezer to rely on. It goes against all the other midrashim, but if you've got one midrash to rely on, that might help you. You know, there is a philosophical question that you could then lean on and build something out of. And that's more or less explains why he pretty much says this position quite clearly, actually. If Aristotle were to prove to us the Kadmut is true, then we will reinterpret Bereshit. We'll reinterpret those psukim. In other words, he is preparing the reader for that possibility that could happen. So the esotericists will say that's because he really believes it. But I think, because there's a better reading of what he's hiding, I think the more plausible reading is a bit more face value but subtle, where he is being subtle about it, it's true. But he's saying, and there's another reason why he would say it, and that is he knows very well that for a lot of his readers, anything less than a full-blown Aristotelianism is naive and unsophisticated. And he wants to keep the door of faith open to them. Right? If you know what's going on at that time, the history of the time, the intelligentsia very often looked down at the masses, even before the issues of when the kind of the intelligentsia of Sepharad, of Andalus, some of them ended up crossing the border into the Ashkenazi lands in Provence, in Catalonia, and so on, and the culture clashes there, where there certainly was this looking down upon the ignorant barbarians or wonderful Talmudists who don't understand philosophy and so on. But even before then already was in the elite circles where Jews and Muslims mixed, was this kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. The masses think in these naive ways, we understand sophisticated. I think, I don't know if any of you come across, Joshua Berman wrote a book recently, a Bible scholar in Barilan called Ani Maamin, where the first half of the book is casting doubt on biblical criticism, and the second half of the book is almost creating theological space should anybody want to give ground to some of the Bible critics. And I believe that what he's doing is very similar to what on this view the Rambam's doing, which is personally, he thinks that Bible criticism is incorrect, but one day somebody may prove it, and there may be people out there who are convinced by the arguments. So let's not close the door on space for you within religious theology. You can ask Joshua Berman yourself if you think that's what he believes. I'm not speaking on his behalf, but I'm giving you that kind of, you could imagine in the right intellectual thought climate, the Rambam is saying what I think is true, and I'll show you why I don't think Aristotle's done the work you guys think he's done. And Rabbi actually attacks him for, not Rabbi, Ibn Tibbon actually says he thinks the Rambam was too kind of religious and traditional about this, although I'll come back to Ibn Tibbon's understanding of Rambam soon. But I'll leave you little hints along the way of were you, which he says quite clearly, Aristotle will someone to come along with a proof for Aristotle, which the Rambam's logical arguments seem to, at this stage, there isn't one. I think the Rambam was really convinced of that. But it doesn't mean there won't be one tomorrow. And I'll leave this world, and I could do it, but I'm not going to do it for you because it's not yet the situation. I don't want to make them equal version, which is why the Rambam doesn't. He's creating a space to survive the continuity of the law. Yes, that I think would be a very good way of saying that. Yes, on this view. And this is a view which is gaining traction in academic circles, as far as I understand. I'm not a professional academic, so it seems to me that from the outside and so on. Did I tell you, I just want to quote for full disclosure, I quoted Rivka Canella. Did I tell you? I don't know what I mentioned in passing. She's my aunt, so I'm a bit biased. But I think, but despite that, I think that's an incredibly strong reading of the guide. Anyway, so what is it he's hiding? I think the answer is this, and I think if you read the Kapach footnotes, especially very, very subtle, beautiful ones, he has a few places in those critical 7 chapters where he takes issue with the Ibn Tibbon translation. I'm not going to go through now, largely because the Rambam himself would be upset with me if I would, and also because we're just very short on time. But essentially, the thesis the Rambam seems to develop is this. The problem we have when we approach God is a problem that he already articulates right at the beginning of the guide. One of the most important chapters of the guide, some of the most important ones are right at the beginning. The second chapter, when he talks about the Chet Adam Harishon, the sin of Adam. And in that chapter, he says essentially the sin of Adam was the movement away from a world where man could perceive in the full seichel of the Tselem Elokim, if you like, perceive emet v'shaka, reality and illusion, truth and falsehood, right and wrong, and instead adopt what we might call in contemporary language a subjective view of tov v'ra. Tov v'ra are feelings, right? In other words, their language, their terms, we use them for ethics, but they're borrowed from aesthetics, essentially. In fact, it's an interesting insight. The Rambam doesn't say this, but it's totally fits with everything he says. The entire vocabulary, certainly in English, and I'm sure it's true in most, if not all languages, of ethics is completely borrowed from aesthetics. So we would say sight, sound, smell, taste is good, beautiful, wonderful, or amazing. And we'll say an act of self-sacrificing, saving someone's life is good, beautiful, wonderful, or amazing. Conversely, a sight, sound, smell, taste that's negative, we'd say is bad, disgusting, horrible, or revolting. And a mass rape or murder, we'd say is bad, disgusting, horrible, or revolting. In other words, because when we say the food tastes good, we mean it makes us feel good. We see the world, as the Nachash says, your eyes will be opened. Your eyes will be opened. You'll be like gods, knowing good and bad. You'll know reality by how it feels to you, no longer reality the way it really is. And that creates the end on the way back to the Derech Etz Chaim, the way of the tree of life, which is to access that tree of life, you're going to have to struggle with the fact that we always see reality as self-projection. And in chapter 5 of the opening of the guide, he says that was the mistake of that Tzilei B'nai Yisrael in chapter 24 of Shemot. What do? Because they still had some physicality, when they looked and tried to grasp God, they made a mistake. They grasped some of the deep form of the inner structure of reality, if we accept the contradiction from later on, or Chomer Rishon. They borrowed something very deep, and they confused it with God himself. And so they came up with, in other words, the philosophical brain by itself can only take you so far. But the reason, and when he talks about the things, the barriers to understanding this material, he lists 5 major barriers, right? Some of them are that people aren't philosophically trained. Some of them are the fact that there's so much work you need to do. It takes years and years of training of the mind to really do this correctly. But then he says, some have naturally bad midot. They just have bad natures, bad character traits. You need humility, you need patience, etc. And then he says some into physical temptations. Now, if he was positing an Aristotelian view, I promise you, lots of people get the Aristotelian view who have very bad midot and have lots of physical temptations. It's not very, it's sophisticated. The average mass person out there may not have been able to do it, but certainly there were plenty of thinkers in his time who would not have necessarily neatly fitted into those 2 areas. But I think what the Rambam's telling you is you see, you're always projecting yourself. And no matter how deep you're going, you're projecting yourself. By the way, here I want to tell you something. If you want to just give some very simple examples of how people, even who think very monotheistically about God in ways the Rambam will be happy, project themselves, just listen to lines like this. You'll hear them all the time. I don't get why God let X or Y or Z happen in the world, which 9 times out of 10 means I don't want that to happen in the world. How come God's not listening to me? How come God doesn't think like I think? How come God doesn't care about what I care about? Right, it's a very subtle but very deep projection of self. Another one you'll sometimes hear, maybe perhaps in people who have a struggle with certain religious commitments, you'll hear, but it's the same error, right? Is I get why God would care about don't kill and don't steal, but why would he care about whether I flick a light on or off on Shabbat or something? Right? It's the same thing. What people are really saying, I mean, why should an infinite being care about what any being does on the edge of some planet in the middle of nowhere in the universe exactly, right? You could ask why does God care if we kill or steal, But the point is that what I'm saying is I care about killing and stealing, so God should care about that. I don't care about lights flicking on and off, so God shouldn't care about that. There's a lot of ways in which we do this, but one of the most of all is, I think, Aristotle, or at least if you take the method of negation like this, you negate all properties and you come up with an inert God, that's also a form of self-projection. Because if God is like me and you were to strip away from me all attributes, I'd be left with nothing but inert being, unconscious being. But that makes a huge assumption that God is like us, such that if you strip things away, you'll be left with nothing. That's also a projection of self. You've got to negate that view too. And that's why Shlomo Melech and Moshe Rabbeinu spent their life getting deeper and deeper. And according to the Rambam, Moshe Rabbeinu always knew where the limit of his ability to grasp ended, where at this point self-projection will come in on a very subtle level. And it was the fact that he didn't look that let him have the zchut that later on, the only person about whom we could say Tmunat Hashem Yabit, right, who could actually grasp, come the close, panim el panim, because he knew exactly where not to go. Right, at every point he knew, now I'm at the edge of my refinement. If I look any further, what I will see will be a projection of self. So philosophy can take you very, very deeply through. Philosophical training can take you very, very deeply through, but it can never take you all the way through. What you're grasping is beyond what the mind can grasp, but it can grasp, just not in ways that could be articulated into words, not in ways that could be put back into ordinary language and concepts. I'm going to leave you with one final thought on this, and then I want to say just a quick remark about the controversy. If you look back at chapters 1 to 7, how the Rambam wrestles with or wants us to wrestle with, he doesn't seem to be wrestling at all, he's got it, with the chapter at the beginning of Yechezkel. He refers us back, or at least he hints back, and most commentators take us back, to chapters 9 and 10 in section 2 of the guide. In section 2 of the guide, the Rambam says that Aristotle thought there was a certain amount of orbits. He thinks Aristotle didn't have the knowledge we had in the days of the Rambam, and that really you can understand all the orbits as 4. And then in chapter 10, the Rambam goes off on this seemingly strange, non-Rambam-esque tangent where he talks about how brilliant it is that there's so many 4s in creation. 4 elements and 4 orbits and 4 causal force and 4 this and 4 that and 4 the other. He just talks about how he had this wonderful thought, thinking about all these 4s. And in Yaakov's dream, there's 4 steps on the ladder and 4 angels. And even if there aren't 4 steps on the ladder, 7, but there's certainly 4 angels, and each one occupies a third of the world. And so he just goes on. And that's one of those very strange chapters when you're reading it. It's like, well, this doesn't feel like the rest of the character of the guide. So until you, of course, you look at Maaseh Merkava, and I'm not going to give any more Rashi Brakim than the Rambam does, but it's very obvious throughout Yechezkel chapter 1, there's lots and lots and lots of number 4s. right? The only question is which one lines up with which, and Ibn Tibbon has his explanation, and others, Efodi and Shem Tov, all the the early interpreters have their interpretations of this, and so on. I think Rav Kapach, if you read his subtle critiques, that are brilliant. But here's what I think I can say, because the Rambam has a chapter on this. You see, the normal interpretation is the Chayot are the Galgalim. There's a reason the Galgalim, meaning the upper realms of the universe. And that leaves you a bit of an unsatisfactory thing, because of the edge, when you get this Rakia, that's kind of the outer Galgal. And when it has this image of the honor of God, or the image of man on the throne, that has to be the Sechel Nivdal, the kind of angels, or the abstract intellect, the active intellects. And that's all he saw. And as Abarbanel writes, that's it. For that, the rabbis have to say Ein Dorashin. I mean, come on, we have lots of people teaching physics that's called Ein. That's all you can come up with, Rambam. And even Ibn Tibbon says that's not good enough. This can't be it. There's got to be that the image includes something about God. I mean, come on, right? But remember, in the end of the second section of the guide, he tells you that when a prophet wants to look at an angel, he can't see an angel. An angel is a Sechel Nivdal. He has to see an image. And if you just take those two together, I'm not going to say anything much more about Maaseh Merkava, because I'm not going to say more than the Rambam gives us in the hints, but there's one or two I'd love to. But in other words, if you're looking at Chayot, you can't see Chayot. So what image is presented? Galgalim. Let's suppose it's Galgalim. I'm not actually so convinced that is, and I don't think Rav Kapach thinks it is, but let's go along with that view. If it's as low as the Galgalim and no higher than that, right? What's it telling you? It's telling you the best way to represent these Malachim sitting in this Chayot is by showing the Galgalim. In other words, the Galgalim and the four Galgalim in the physical universe are expressions and manifestations of the four Chayot. In other words, the Rambam is building this structure of four, so that every four you see is a projection of a level above. And you start by studying physics. And if you get into Aristotle's metaphysics, you realize how you learn metaphysics, not by observation, because we can't really observe what's going on, although we can use a little bit of observation, but by speculation as to the relationship between causes and effects. So what must be the causal structure that underlies this effect? And then you start to go deeper than that. And then you start to go deeper than that. And then you start to go deeper than that. But you're always dealing with fours, just more and more and more abstract, until you go deeper than that, deeper than that, deeper than that. And if you look at all the chapters of the guide, you might notice other chapters that do with the number 4 as well. But the point is that we are starting from somewhere as we study God. And obviously the root of all of this is an emanation of the first cause. And you're climbing the ladder, and you've got to know when to stop. And then you've got to know when you're ready to abstract further, you go further, deeper. And then you've got to abstract, you go deeper, and you go deeper, and you go deeper. And the Navi is setting us some of the steps on the ladder as to how to do some of that work. I think I'm out of time. To have 5 more minutes, Yeah, okay. Because what I'd like to come back to, why do we assume? Okay, I'll try and deal with the questions soon. Okay. So now the challenge, however, is that although Ibn Tibbon criticizes the Rambam, and Ibn Tibbon himself, by the way, who's the translator of the Rambam, about whom the Rambam says he understood my work. And Ibn Tibbon is a later, was young at the time the Rambam died, but he was already working on this translation. And Ibn Tibbon himself was a committed Averroesian fellow, Ibn Rushd. He was a follower of Ibn Rushd. In fact, almost all of the 4 classical commentaries on the guide, by which I mean Caspi, Rav Yosef Caspi, and Rav Moshe Narvoni, and Rav Shem Tov, all of these pretty much seem to take they themselves were mostly followers of Ibn Rushd. The actual Rav Moshe Narvoni himself, I think, is the one who does the translation work. Actually, translates one of Ibn Rushd's works, Averroes's works, into Hebrew, and introduced it to the Jewish community exactly at the time of the major controversy, which I think was in Montpelier, which is, of course, exactly where the whole thing, where the book burnings then took place. But basically speaking, I'm just going to share a little noted that I wanted to make for myself, just to make sure I cover this accurately. But essentially speaking, yeah, Rav Shem Tov was the one in Montpellier did the translation. But they now Ibn Tibbon has a beautiful way, but he criticized the Rambam for being not Aristotelian enough. He says the Rambam had this, except in the Maaseh Merkavah, he thinks he was a bit too. But he has this amazing line, which he uses twice in his writings after criticizing the Rambam for not being Aristotelian enough. He himself was an Aristotelian, who says, Zeh al pi pshuto. He says it in his Pirush on Kohelet, of which we have many of the documents, and he says it on the Ma'amari Kavu HaMayim. In both of these, he hints to the possibility that maybe there's another reading of the Rambam in which he really was an Aristotelian. Now, what we realize going on because of him, right, and because of Rav Yitzchak Shem Tov, who was alive at the actual battle, when the battle reaches most intense, and was active in Montpellier, and was a committed Averroian philosopher himself, very much so, and often seems to interpret the Rambam that way, is that a very live view amongst this intelligentsia and elite was, together with their Muslim friends, was that we'd come on. Aristotle is the way sophisticated people think, right? That must, and sometimes they thought the Rambam did think that, and sometimes they thought he might have thought that, and so on. And as well as the fact that, so they were pushing things much further than the Rambam himself was going. Yeah, Averroes, I think you're right, probably right. Okay, thank you. But wherever they were going, this was a view that was being widely propagated in the name of the Rambam. And interestingly enough, in one of the attacks, in many of the attacks on these Maimonideans, was even the argument that they should never have translated the works of the Rambam. They were meant to be clearly, which is clearly not true. Rambam was quite happy they were translating it, but also that they've mistranslated. Now, a lot of that was because by that phase, the Rambam's honor was too well established for anyone to challenge it. But I think there's no question that the fact that there was a widespread Aristotelian view in many of the early commentators, or the Rambam, there was almost, I think, an embarrassment that Rambam didn't go as far as Aristotelian position. But since he was the closest anybody came and had such authority, it kind of became, surely a Rambam really was. And if he wasn't quite, he might have been type of thing. And that was all that people were seeing in his great defender's name. That really Rambam held there was no creation. And along with that, a lot of these people going along with, and God doesn't really intervene in the world. And this doesn't really happen. So you see the fuel to the fire that made for the Maimonidean controversy. I think that's really, really important element to add to this understanding of what was going on. I think it's often presented as if it was kind of, that philosophy was too much for these people. And I'm not sure if that's a very accurate portrayal of what's going on. Although it's very hard to work out because we only have about 15 or 20 papers from the time and letters. So we've got to try and do all the deduction work. But there is almost no question that was I was going to say burning issue, but whatever. But excuse the pun. But that's going on over there. Now, the last thing I want to say by the way, Rav Moshe ibn Tibbon, who was a son of Rav Shmuel ibn Tibbon, took a much more conservative interpretation of the Rambam, which is possible Rav Shmuel himself did. There's only two hints that Rav Shmuel thought differently. And obviously, Rabbi Avraham ben HaRambam himself, there's no hint anywhere that he thought his father was really an Aristotelian. Not even a subtle hint for somebody somewhere in a private letter. He certainly took a more conservative interpretation of the Rambam, which over time became the dominant view. Although because these commentaries exist and were learnt with the Mora, they were always around. Rav Kapach, I think, subtly shows where he disagrees with them in the commentaries. The final thing I'll just say by way of kind of remarks on this particular topic is I do think once we understand the Rambam as using the projection model of deepening our understanding of reality, which coupled with understanding where to do negation and where we are self-projecting, actually makes the Rambam open to what one might call a mystical interpretation, by which I don't mean the Rambam had Kabbalah. It's very, very difficult to argue that anyone in the Andalusian world had Kabbalah. Even sounds in the Gemara like whatever knowledge was held was lost in Yeshivat Pumbedisa in the days of the Amoraim. So if there was any such knowledge, it might have gone out from Eretz Yisrael in a different direction. It certainly didn't go through the Maghrib and Andalus, at least according to any evidence that we have in any writings of anybody around there. I think is fair to say there are, people who seem to think differently, but the Rambam, apart from what he writes in Mishnah Torah about the love of God and how this coming close to God in mind builds a deep love of God, and you do it through understanding the natural world, I think he really thinks that you can actually have not a grasp of God, but a grasp of God's expression. But because everything in the world is ultimately God's expression, but you've got to learn how to do it very, very deeply through methodical evaluation of what have I got so far? That's not God, but it's an expression of God. It's the kavod, if you like, maybe not even that high. But now, how can I go deeper? Am I ready to go deeper? Am I self-projecting, or am I able to negate and be a little closer, and then a little closer, and then a little closer? So the intellect can each phase do some work. The purity of the self will then either see or not see. And depending on how self-aware one is, will be on how deep and how deep and how deep one can go. But what I will say is, and I hope you don't shoot me down for this, is that's not a million miles away from what, if you like, the more Maimonidean interpretations of filtering of what the Mukubalim are doing. I'm not going to say there isn't a fierce clash to be had, but later on in Spain, when a lot of the great Mukubalim tried to filter the Kabbalistic thing through the prism of the Rambam, I don't think they had no grounds to work on. I'm not saying there weren't exaggerations here and there, but the idea that we can be deepening and deepening and deepening, and via whatever it is, getting closer and closer and closer, is not the same as Kabbalah, but it's not a million miles away either. And I actually think that it can be one of the most powerful. I think there's such a room to study, especially if you want to take an Andalusian tradition. There can be no greater thing than spending our lives studying chapters 1 to 7 of the third section of the guide, and then going back and reading the whole guide as setting up those chapters, and then climbing the ladder a little bit higher and coming down. And what a joyful, spiritual, mystical experience that can be as each of us tries to climb the ladder that little bit higher. With that, I will finish my remarks and open for questions. I don't know, Sina, do you want me to take the ones that are in the chat?
Wow, yeah, Rav, that was, I mean, I'm rarely speechless. I think the people in the group know how much I talk, but that was very, very, very enlightening. And it reminded me of the line from Hacham Faor, where he says, beyond the cutting edge of reason lies a higher reality that rational humanity can intuitively grasp, but cannot articulate.
His Homo Mysticus, I think, takes a very, very, very similar position to this. He's not the only one, but I think it's a beautiful articulation.
100%, exactly as you've said. I really do feel that way. I think it'll be great to go through some of the questions if you have some time, Rav.
Sure. Do you want to read out which ones you think
Sure. So, we've got one here from Gidon Fira. Why do we assume the guide is the position of HaRambam as opposed to a position paper written to a Talmud, the more yeshivish position? What evidence is there that HaRambam actually believed anything in the Moreh that contradicts the Yat or Perush HaMishnayot?
So it's a fair question. I'm not so sure that there's a lot of major contradictions between the two. There are some here and there, and one has to work carefully at each one. But I think the major positions are already there. Remember, if you read Hilchot Yesodei Torah, if you read them, you'll see already that he's saying a lot of the things that he ends up saying in the guide, right? The de-anthropomorphization is already there. The idea that the Galgalim having consciousness in the Aristotelian model of the universe is absolutely there. The slightly more Aristotelian virtue of the metaphysics and the consciousness of the Galgalim and the Sechalim Nivdalim and all the Malachim and all this kind of stuff. It's all there actually in chapters 2, 3, and 4 of Hilchot Yesodei Torah. So a lot of these things are already there. His interpretation of what Nevuah is there. His view of the limitation on Nisim, all these things are already there. So I don't think there's much sense in which his main position in the guide significantly contradicts things he says earlier. Maybe give an example of what you're thinking of in the contradiction.
Okay.
Do you want to?
He's written nothing specific.
Okay, so I think that the people who think there's a contradiction are typically those who believe that in the esoteric view, the Rambam was in the guide, he's really, of course, an Aristotelian. Then everything contradicts everything he said earlier. So on that view, the end got to decide which is the authentic one. But I think if we read the guide, like I was saying tonight, then I'm not saying there's nothing that contradicts here and there, but okay, Rambam has through his life, he develops, like in Halacha, he develops a less Gaonic view on a lot of issues as he moves on. There's a lot of things that change, but not massively, not more than any other brilliant Rishon or Acharon or anybody in history really, who does that. So I on this reading, I think he's very, very, he's not 1,000,000%, but very consistent with the broad thinking he has already in the Pirush Mishnah and in the Mishnah Torah as well. I'm not sure there's such enormous, again, there'll be nitpicks to be had. He actually slightly, as I said, loosens the possibility of Nissim over here and other things like that. But I think what he's doing is he's giving a lot more of the methodology and working that's necessary to read the Ma'aser Merkava here. That he doesn't do in those works, really. He just says that one day he'll write about it. I think the purported and alleged, those who say there was a Rambam and a Maimonides and which one's the true one, are actually assuming a Straussian position of the Rambam.
Exactly. Rob, I had a question before I go to Daniel's question, actually. From what I've understood, from a lot of the things that I've read, very limited on HaRambam, you've got sensory perceptions that exist, and you then either filter them through imagination or you filter them through rationality. HaRambam held that you filter it through a rational thought processor, if you like, and then you go to the mystical realm, if you like, or the imaginative realm. Whereas the issue that he found was that some may actually filter it through their imagination and then do post-imaginative rationalization, which, that's where you get the self-projection.
That's one issue, but see, one has to know what they're imagining and what they're not when they use imagination. That's very, very important for Rambam. Rambam will tell you that a Navi, can sometimes see something where it's the word association that's the clue. And sometimes you'll see an image in Nevuah. Okay, Nevuah is more imagination oriented and needs the work of the rational deductive process to work out what on earth is actually going on. But he says specifically about some of the words that in Ma'aser Merkava that they're there, the Navi sees some image where he's meant to work out what's the Hebrew word, then play around with the letters and come up with the concept. So, but always the danger is that if you don't get the proper balance between working out what's imagination, what's the image that the mind has and what's the intellect, then you'll do what Tzile B'nai Yisrael did. And by the way, I'm not sure if he doesn't think that was Aristotle's error. You can easily confuse Kadmot this way. Again, he won't overtly attack on that level either, but between the lines, I'm not sure if that Tzile B'nai Yisrael isn't an excellent description in his view of even a brilliant thinker who, they're looking as far as the brain can go, but what you actually see is shaped by you.
Yep. Thank you. Daniel Jonas has asked, all esotericisms are not equal. So why this idea of an esoteric position?
The one I'm talking about, which point of the talk was the an?
That was more that when you were saying that there was an academic position of esotericism, and it seems a bit of a stretch to say that all esotericisms can be grouped together in that kind of way. I'm not sure. I don't think.
Well, you're talking about what Strauss was saying?
It's what you said the academics were saying, and that may also be what Strauss is saying.
Which are those different academics, different points. There's two esotericist claims of the Rambam. Number one, that he is really more Aristotelian than he said, and then a more extreme position, which is he wasn't really sure God existed. Now, Strauss is more controversial for saying that all writings pre-18th century, or many or most, or whatever exactly the number is, have esotericism within them. But I'm not sure which one of those.
We've got a question here, last question here from Kenneth. Question on the interpretation of HaRambam as a skeptic about Hashem's existence. The language is clearly dealing with the point in epistemic terms about the limit of human comprehension. Yet this extreme interpretation shifts the conclusion to a metaphysical one about whether Hashem exists.
Well, the point about the metaphysical one is all our metaphysical conclusions require an epistemological justification. So if you can establish the existence of something on the basis of an argument, and that argument requires on a certain epistemological position, which then you feel is undermined, then you don't have a basis to reach the conclusion. Certainly in those days, it would not have been accepted just to say, and the Rambam doesn't hint that you could just do it because of tradition or just do it because of some intuition, although those are plausible positions, but potentially. But then, and the Kuzari seems to have positions like this, who wrote before the Rambam in Andalus, but it's not, doesn't seem anywhere to be the Rambam's position. I'm
sorry, Rob, but that seems to invert the necessary and the sufficient condition, there, right? I mean, because what the Rav seems to be saying is that one can't reach a metaphysical conclusion without establishing the epistemic route to get there. But if Rambam's only, so the epistemic is the necessary condition,
Sure.
right? But if Rambam's point in this question that ends up being this kind of more extreme interpretation is simply that we can't have direct access or direct knowledge because of our limitation, then it doesn't thereby justify someone else then saying he's trying to make a metaphysical conclusion. He may only be making an epistemic point there.
Right. But yes, but since in the earlier chapters he reached that conclusion through knowledge. This is the argument they're trying to make, through knowledge through deduction, assuming certain amount of knowledge of the spheres and the Galgalim and so on. If he then were to say on their reading that actually we don't really have that knowledge, what they want to say is therefore we can't make that deduction. Therefore, the conclusion is not definitely not true. That would be obviously a logical fallacy, but it's not definitely true either.
Yeah, it just didn't seem like it was enough to make that extreme conclusion that the Rambam is a skeptic about Hashem's existence based on the fact that he's already, because he's talking about our epistemic limitation. That's all I was trying to say.
But that what they want to argue, yes, I understand what you're saying, but I think what they want to argue is that he talks about it specifically at the nerve point of the methodology through which he got to the conclusion that God does exist. That's what they want to argue, because now the Rambam actually uses, what he does is he takes, his strategy is to say either there's a creation or there isn't. On the creation argument, you've got God at the end of it. On the, if you take the more Aristotelian view, you've also got God at the end of it. So, but the Aristotelian bit does need, or at least they assume it is, that we understand enough about the Galgalim to get there. Now, I happen to agree with you. I think if this is the point you're making, that actually the particular bit that he ends up being epistemically skeptical about, our epistemic access to certain facts about the Galgalim, actually has nothing to do with how he uses the fact of the Galgalim in the argument. So it wouldn't have even undermined that. And you are right, we could have a lot of skepticism about where the human brain goes and still be believers in God, but it would undermine, what they want to say is if that skepticism was where they think it sounds like it is, then it would throw, it would basically undermine the entire argument the Rambam had spent several chapters developing.
Okay, thanks.
Pleasure.
Brilliant. Rav?
I'm going to say, Daniel, I saw some comments here. So I agreed with the two comments that Daniel said over here. In effect, he's creating space for survival of the community. Yes. And also the one about physics, you can't see electrons, you're going to demonstrate. Yes. I think there's I'm trying to skim through, see if there's anything else that I missed out. Okay. There's quite a few comments here. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Sina, you want to say goodbye to me? I mean, is that
unless you want to stay? But,
I'm happy to stay. No. If you think it's a good time to end, I'm very happy to leave as well, whatever you want.
No. I think if there's any other comments on the group chat that you want to address, if you want to have a quick look.
We shall have a quick look. Doesn't HaRambam write explicitly chapter 26 there isn't a problem with those who believe in the eternity of the universe? He says that he could do it if that was proven, yes. But that's not the same as saying he thinks it's true. When you're setting up the mass position, okay, I spoke about that when it came up. Question about the interpretation of skeptic, I think we've dealt with that one. Question related to all these who wrote that was spoken yes. Okay, I think I've doesn't influence the world also shows a Mishmana Prakim. That's true. Yeah, that's fair. Perhaps you could see what would happen if the great eagle actually expressed the metaphysical position. That would be immediately an argument from authority, and you couldn't question without questioning his honor. Look at the argument with the Goanim in the Mishnah Torah intro, the honor being less important than the ability to correctly make an argument. I don't remember on which point that comment was raised, so I'm not. Dan's one is
when we were trying to work out whether he's actually going to indicate his position or whether he's not going to indicate his position.
Right.
Okay. Argue that on what these points are, he's really trying to avoid being pinned down anywhere. Actually.
Right. There are, by the way, if you look at Halbertal's book on the Rambam, he does take this possible position that the Rambam was almost being deliberately multi-possibility. I think the Rambam's articulated position, though, is almost for sure his real position.
Right.
But I mean, I'm not sure if he's offering other possibilities, at least not on the interpretation of oh, there you go, fine. At least not on the interpretation I quoted from the scholars I quoted that take this kind of view that the Rambam did have his position, but he wanted to leave the door open to other positions. In that situation, he does articulate his view, I'm not sure if he would have necessarily been so upset if somebody argued from authority. If he was that bothered, he would probably not have written the Mishnah Torah the way he did. That lends itself to argument for authority, even if he himself didn't want to. I mean, if he was that sensitive to God forbid you should ever take me on authority, I doubt he'd have written Mishnah Torah the way he did. Either he wasn't so sensitive to it, or he didn't mind it, or he did mind it, but just didn't think people would do that to him. But yeah, but it is, you know, you could take the more Aristotelian position and open it up a little bit looser than that as well.
What's the Rav's feeling about the Halbertal book?
Look, again, I have to be very careful. I'm still learning the Rambam. You know, I don't know how many times you get to the guide, you always come up with new things. So it could be if I give the talk in 3 years' time, I'll have a different position. I think first of all, Halbertal is a brilliant scholar. He's taking the different and he's distilling it, which is, by the way, a particular skill and ingenuity, to be able to take incredibly complex things about which there's a lot of technical debate and bring it down to a level where us non-technically proficient people, or no, I don't know about all of us, don't know about all of you, but let's say other readers like some of us at least, and be able to really follow it and find it interesting. I think there's always an incredible skill to be able to do that. And I think that's why he's now, he does hint that it's possible the Rambam was leaving lots of doors open. And I think that's very consistent with what the view I was taking, which was the view I was articulating on behalf of those scholars I was quoting, which doesn't quite go as extreme, as open, very similar, but it's just the Rambam is saying what he sounds like he's saying, but yes, he is also keeping some doors open. So I'd say, you know, that's what I think is to me at least seems by far the most plausible reading. But I don't think you can ever, you know, and there's so many brilliant minds have analyzed it in so many different directions. I think you have to always have the humility to realize that. And the Rambam deliberately wrote what he wrote cryptically. You've always got to have the open-mindedness to, it might be different to that.
Seems like to me when I read it that he was downplaying the cryptic side of it a little bit.
Who, Halbertal? Yeah, I think he is,
Yeah.
and I think for good reason. I think Halbertal is certainly not, although he opens up, but I think he doesn't go as far as I suspect, but he's been on here before. Someone can ask him directly. I suspect that he wouldn't take a Straussian position.
Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant.
Okay. I'm happy to stay on if you want. You don't need to be polite and British. Those of you who are not British, don't need to be polite and British and just hang on. We'll say goodbye to everyone. And anyone does want to stay on and talk, I'll stay on for a few more minutes.
That sounds fantastic. Rob,
and I want to say a big thank you. It's such a privilege. I've met so many of you I've only seen on Facebook chats that I occasionally pop into. I'm not very active on social media usually, but I get sucked into these sort of conversations every so often. And I always think, I think there's so many people here to learn so much from. And so it's good to be able to be a Sephardi for the night. I'll pretend, drawn on some imaginary Andalusian roots. Conceptual. I like your idea that it's about thinking.
Conceptual.
I do have my
it's nothing racial. It's ideological.
As you know, I've got my skepticism about whether one can actually draw that line. But for the sake of the Chabra tonight, we're proud to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for having. Thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to seeing everybody next week. Tuesday, not Wednesday. Chabra next week is Tuesday. Where we'll be going through Hacham Atlubabadi's Teshuvah. And on that, I bid you all a good night and thank you very much to the Rav.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Good night, everyone. Sina, you're staying on for a few minutes? And anyone else who wants to, you're welcome to stay on as well.
Yeah, I have to check. My wife might.
Yeah, okay. If you need to disappear,
I wash the baby's bottles, and usually at 9:45 I do them, so I've just got to check that.
You're a good man.
Just do that.
Fine. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Rob.
Pleasure. Abby, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Rabbi.
And Rob, you'll send me the recording, is that right?
Okay, yeah, I'll send that. I'll email it to you.
Yeah, because we basically have a YouTube page, and we'll be putting it up on there.